over to the Cody Peterson shortly. So tonight we're doing emotion displacement and rearrangements with Cody Peterson, and this is going to be taken from his book, of course, The Shadow of a Figure of Light, the archetype of the alcoholic, and the journey to enlightenment. Now, if you want to join in with us, please do. We do say a version of the set-aside prayer here. If you want to join in, please do. So using your own idea of God, God, please help me to set aside everything that I think I know with an open mind to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And of course, we're thinking of the alcoholics who have yet to find the solution. They haven't even read the big book yet, let alone Cody Peterson's book, but they're on their way to reading it at some point in the future. Hopefully they will. And with that, we're going straight over to Cody Peterson. Thank you, Cody. Hopefully you can unmute yourself. Hopefully you can.
I was getting blocked by a certain thing. So let's see how I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to welcome everyone, and I want to express gratitude for you guys to have me back. It is just a great honor. I'm really excited to be able to share monthly. It gives me a lot to do and to think about, and I'm super excited about this topic. We're talking about emotional sobriety, as David said, and so I'm going to look at Bill Wilson's talk, or not his talk. It was an essay that he wrote called "The Next Frontier: Emotional Sobriety," and this is the first of a series that I'm going to do here. So just one time per month. I'll try to keep each of the talks kind of self-contained. They won't build too much on each other, but they will some. I call this a case for coming down, recovering soul in the program of recovery. And because I've gotten a new perspective on emotional sobriety. And I found some stuff that I'm just really excited to share. And so, with that, we're just going to jump right in. So I've noticed a trend, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that I'm online a lot now with different groups from around the world. And I've noticed that a lot of people leave Alcoholics Anonymous, but don't relapse. I don't know if you guys have noticed it in your area. It can be hard to see if you're kind of, in the middle of the herd, as they say. And they're not relapsing. They're going to therapy. They're going to other 12-step groups, ACA, Al-Anon, SLA. They're joining religion. And the truth about it is, a lot of good, sober members are choosing to kind of step out. And I've thought a lot about this lately. And I think that the reason they leave is because they're looking for emotional sobriety, that whatever that is, right? Emotional sobriety. And then the question arises, does AA provide emotional sobriety? Can a person get emotionally sober in Alcoholics Anonymous? I believe that we can get sober in AA. I believe that emotional sobriety can be discovered basically anywhere, in any interaction with human beings, every relationship, every human involvement. Once we understand what it is and we see what it is, then we can actually facilitate it basically everywhere. But the thing that I've discovered about emotional sobriety is that it's not, we don't find it where we would expect to find it. And that's what this presentation is about today. Emotional sobriety requires a new paradigm. I think that I really appreciate the idea of emotional sobriety as a metaphor, a kind of a living metaphor of getting sober, right? Getting sober emotionally. When I got sober physically, if I were to define that in the attitude that I had to really cultivate in early sobriety in order to get sober physically would be one of complete open-mindedness, right? Um, and especially because I had gone in and out for so long, I had so many ideas about what AA was and what sobriety was, that until I was willing to really set all that stuff aside and just kind of go with the flow, I wasn't going to be able to get sober emotionally or physically. And I think emotional sobriety is the same thing. It requires a new paradigm. And I'm going to introduce this new paradigm today. Um, so I want to say this too. Emotional sobriety is the word or the phrase that we use, that Bill Wilson used, to describe a human issue. This is not something that only alcoholics or drug addicts have to wrestle with. This means that we can pull from others, right, as we kind of make a case for emotional sobriety and try to examine, what exactly it is. And of course, I like to pull from depth psychology, right? I think the psychologists, especially the ones in the Jungian tradition, just have so much good stuff to talk about. And what I've discovered is that they have a lot to say about emotional sobriety, although they call it something else. And we'll get into that in a minute. They've, when and so I'm really trying to approach this from a perspective of depth and weight. And those are Silkworth's words. Wilson quoted Silkworth early on in the Big Book. And Silkworth talks about a message of depth and weight. And I think that for depth, I understand that to be of a psychological nature, right? There's a certain kind of depth that we need to sort of excavate, or it's almost like an archaeological strata, like below the surface. That's what this depth thing is. And I think that weight speaks to emotional gravity, right? So and what I mean by that is that it really gets to the human relationships. There I feel like weight refers to this burden of human intimacy, and I feel human intimacy to be very heavy. It's very difficult for me to bear. It's a new thing, and I think that weight kind of captures that. Without depth and weight, I think our program tends to plateau. It turns into a series of platitudes, right? Platitude, plateau, they basically mean the same thing. And so, and I think what can happen is, and this has certainly happened for me, I without depth and weight and without emotional sobriety, I end up feeling more and more isolated, even though I'm surrounded by people. So I kind of end up back in the same boat that I was in early sobriety. Now, I think that depth also refers to psyche, right? Silkworth talks about having an entire psychic change. And the Greek word for psyche is soul. And so that's why I think that emotional sobriety is about recovering the soul, or recovering soul in the program of recovery. And that's really going to be the emphasis today. So this is an interesting concept here, because the slide says post-Jungian and post-Wilsonian, a post-Jungian approach and a post-Wilsonian approach. So to be a post-Jungian, I've found that post-Jungians have a lot, they're very helpful in this particular, arena, this particular exploration. But to be a post-Jungian means that a person doesn't worship Jung, but they wrestle with Jung's ideas, right? And the reason these ideas from these certain philosophers, if you want to call them that, which Wilson is certainly one of them, their ideas can endure over time because they can withstand the rebuttal from the world, right? They can take the wrestling. Bill Wilson, like Carl Jung, deserves to be engaged critically. So to be post-Wilsonian means that we don't worship Bill Wilson, right? But that we actually wrestle with his ideas. We wrestle with the legacy that he's left for us. Now, a post-Wilsonian tradition has already begun to emerge. I think that Ernie Kurtz started the tradition with his book, Not God. That book makes a really good case for not worshiping Bill Wilson, and tries to sort of to challenge some of the ideas that we get in our fellowship about our relationship to Bill Wilson. The next book is clearly William Schaberg's book, Writing the Big Book. That's very post-Wilsonian. Schaberg challenges Wilson's own method of writing the book, his methods of storytelling. He calls him a myth maker, which he clearly is based on Schaberg's evidence, his scholarship. So what's revealed here is that Bill Wilson is a very complex and evolving thinker, and he's certainly not infallible. Wilson himself was also post-Wilsonian, and I think that we lose track of this in our current sort of perspective. Wilson warned against this sort of growing orthodoxy that he saw developing within AA. And he encouraged people to sort of try to go beyond it. So this is what Wilson says. I think I got this from Bill Schaberg's book, actually, Writing the Big Book. So Bill says, as time passes, our literature has the tendency to get more and more frozen, a tendency for conversion into something like dogma, a human trait that I'm afraid we can do little about. We may as well face the fact that AA will always have its fundamentalists, its absolutists, and its relativists. And tying this back into to our topic, right, that emotional sobriety is by its very nature a post-Wilsonian idea. And I think for us to really engage with this concept of emotional sobriety requires that we critically engage with Wilson and with his ideas, as well as some of the aspects of his own behavior, his own life and stuff that could be perceived as questionable, which we're not going to get into that today. I'm going to save that for a later date. But the thing is, this by allowing Wilson the right to be a human being, we honor him the most that we possibly can. And I think if we want to really give Alcoholics Anonymous the legs to move into the future, then we need to be able to critically engage with this stuff from within. It's very important. So that brings us to the next frontier, emotional sobriety. That's the name of Wilson's 1958 Grapevine essay. And so this marks uncharted territory, and it really speaks to what's missing, right? It's the next frontier, yet explored territory, which by definition is post-Wilsonian. This means that emotional sobriety is for each of us a journey into the unknown. It's a journey into psyche, right? And to get into this next frontier requires right off the bat that we go beyond our existing AA frameworks. Also, and this is very important, it also requires that we go beyond existing cultural frameworks, right? And those are the same frameworks that sort of house Alcoholics Anonymous. So it grew up into this civilization and into this culture, right? And it's as such, it's bound by the culture within which it exists, right? And as I said before, this problem of emotional sobriety or lack thereof is a human problem, right? So, and this is I'm going to read quickly the parts of the essay that we're going to examine today. There's going to be a couple more later, but this is Bill Wilson from the Grapevine in January of 1958. He says, I think that many oldsters who have put our AA booze cure to severe but successful tests still find they often lack emotional sobriety. Even then, as we hew away, peace and joy may still elude us. That's the place so many of us AA oldsters have come to, and it's a hell of a spot, literally. How shall the unconscious, from which so many of our fears, compulsions, and phony aspirations still stream, be brought into line with what we actually believe, know, and want? How to convince our dumb, raging and hidden Mr. Hyde becomes our main task. And so, as we know, right, from hard-won experience, that Mr. Hyde, that autonomous psychic complex that he calls Mr. Hyde, it cannot be convinced, it cannot be bargained with, and it cannot be willpowered away through any sort of discipline. And so then what's required here, but by Bill's own admission, is a new paradigm, right? And this is where I like to bring this Jungian framework in to help us understand this. So I'm going to call this paradigm, I'm going to call it feeling, all right? And this idea is a little tricky to understand, but so is emotional sobriety. And I think if we just glaze over emotional sobriety and tell ourselves that we already know what it is, then we're going to miss the point. Just like we would have missed physical sobriety had we not approached it with a completely and utterly open mind. That's at least my experience. So we're trying to break emotional sobriety free from the sort of perhaps dogma, if you will, that's kind of bound it for the last 50 years since Wilson introduced it. Emotional sobriety is very broad and an interesting topic, right? It's very profound. It's hard to pin down. It's nebulous, shifty, and it exists in the realm of human relationship. Okay, and by defining feeling and then equating that with emotional sobriety, I think we can make some big some progress in this weird realm, this weird journey into the next frontier. So this is. I pulled this off of Google. This is the definition of feeling. I'll try to unpack it for us. In Jungian psychology, feeling is a rational psychological function that involves making value judgments based on subjective criteria of acceptance or rejection rather than objective intellectual connections. So he's saying there, or Google says that feeling then is a way that we make decisions, value judgments about whether something is good or bad for us based on subjective criteria rather than objective, like thinking thoughts, right? So feeling, and I'm gonna talk about feeling the entire time next session, just to really define it and compare it to emotional sobriety. But feeling then is a subjective measure of arriving to conclusions. It says it is a process of evaluating experiences or relationships as good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, beautiful or ugly. Unlike emotions or affects, which are often immediate and physical, feeling is a more considered, subjective judgment. So feeling then is sort of like an internal compass, right? That allows us to navigate the world and to make decisions about the world based on how things affect us, right? Often it includes emotion, but it's not, it's feeling is not tied to emotion. Feeling is almost like a relational radar, right? It allows us to assess our own needs as well as to assess others' needs and then make decisions based on whether or not we can help people or not, right? Feeling allows us to understand what intimacy is, right? Feeling is the plane of relationships. So, and whenever I say feeling, I can say emotional sobriety. It's the same thing, right? So this kind of this sort of and I like this because Wilson talks about values in the fourth step. And he says we shouldn't confuse ourselves about values. And then in later on in the sex inventory, he tells us to sort of that we need to develop an ideal in terms of our sexual relationships, right? That ideal in a very big way is emotional sobriety, right? So, and it goes from our sexual relations to the other parts of our human interactions, right? And as we develop this ideal, what we're developing is actually what Jung would call feeling. So, and this is important because this allows us to go ahead and make more subtle judgments, right? Based on whether something's good or bad, on an internal compass and an internal sense. So I'll get into this more later, but when I mention feeling, this is kind of what I'm talking about. And again, I know that this is confusing, and I wish there was an easier way for me to explain it. And feeling is just like that, especially for men. You know, you can take a Myers-Briggs test online. It's free to figure out whether you're a feeling or a thinking type, right? And most usually, and I'll talk about this next time, usually women are feeling types while men are thinking types. And so, and once you see this, like, it's everywhere. You know, women talk about how they arrive to conclusions and decisions based on feeling, while men are talking about thinking all the time, right? And the goal of emotional sobriety then is that we develop this feeling function. So, with that, I want to get into kind of some more of the aspects of this. So, as I said earlier, so the Jungians were talking about this feeling function and how feeling has sort of gone dark, right? Especially for men. I think Wilson caught a glimpse of feeling when he introduced the idea of emotional sobriety. Now, Wilson had spent time with the Jungian therapist. He also read one of Jung's books, Modern Man in Search of the Soul. So he may have had feeling in his mind when he wrote about this. It's impossible to say. But he certainly wasn't foreign to the concept. But the point about this is that this is a broad sort of all-inclusive issue especially within the West. And so we can use these other scholars and these other spiritual gurus to help us kind of navigate this terrain. T.S. Eliot from East Coker, one of his poems, this is what he writes about this venture into the next frontier, which is also the venture into emotional sobriety. Notice how similar these ring. And so each venture is a new beginning, arrayed on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again, and now under conditions that seem unpropitious. So T.S. Eliot is essentially talking about this journey into the next frontier, and he's telling us that we're making this trek ill-prepared, right? We have an imprecise map. We're going at it in a total mess of emotion. And we're looking for something we don't even know whether it exists or not, right? As we look at this over the next bit, we're going to see that this is actually a problem that has existed since the foundation of Western civilization, is literally 3,000 years old. It traces back to Plato and Aristotle, and it has its basis in this idea that we have, that in order for us to achieve spiritual enlightenment, we must suppress or abandon our emotions, or the affects and emotions of our body. And I'm going to pull a lot from James Hillman, who is a post-Jungian, and he explores this idea a lot, how feeling has gone dark. And he says the consequence of that sort of that spiritual pursuit, the way it's been done in this culture, is, he says, quote, "We are at a loss, not knowing how to feel, where to feel, why to feel, or even if we feel." And so this is the vision that Wilson caught, right? It's that we've lost feeling. And so the goal here then with emotional sobriety is that we try to get feeling back. And what does that even mean, right? Now, the modern spiritual crisis can be defined as emotional numbness, which parades around as spiritual enlightenment. And this is by definition, this is spiritual bypass. Okay. This is what John Wellwood says about spiritual bypass. He introduced the concept in the 1980s. He says spiritual bypass is defined as the use of one's spirituality, spiritual beliefs, spiritual practices, and spiritual life to avoid experiencing the emotional pain of working through psychological issues. So Wilson was certainly a visionary in so many different ways, because he's writing about spiritual bypass decades before John Wellwood wrote about it. This gets to the heart of men's issues. It'll feel a lot almost political at times. But men especially, we tend to attribute our lack of feeling to spiritual transcendence. I have so much personal experience in this realm, it's disgusting. It's always this thing of like, you know, get in a fight with my wife. My mind goes to, well, the book says, you know, if you know that spiritual axiom, if I'm upset, something's wrong with me. And so clearly you're upset, so something must be wrong with you. And I can hide behind these spiritual tenets and these spiritual platitudes, not even knowing that what I'm missing is this whole underlying world, this third dimension, that's feeling, right? So I want to say this. When I talk about the case for coming down, the point of this is, and I'll try to build on this as much as I can, right? That we've rocketed to the fourth dimension. The book tells us we've rocketed, right? But that we've skipped right over the third dimension, which is the plane of human relationships. And that's where that feeling is the function of relationship. All right. I also want to say this. People crave this stuff. I've been doing a book study here in my hometown, and I've been trying to talk as much about emotional sobriety as I can. I've been trying to be intimate and vulnerable. I've been trying to build a community with other men, especially in my vicinity. And it's this little pocket of enthusiasm for vulnerability and intimacy has just exploded. It's wonderful. It's the most precious thing like I could ever imagine. And the other day I was driving down the road and I was telling my wife, Ming, about a relationship, a friendship that is brewing with a man who, and I was saying, you know, this is great. Like we sort of support each other emotionally. I feel intimate, like I can share with him. He shares with me. There's this beautiful kind of friendship flowering, and it just feels so good to be intimate with another man. And I'm saying these words, and as I'm driving, it suddenly like struck me, like I heard the words I was saying. Like I heard myself from a different perspective, and I got struck with such a deep fear, and like I was like embarrassed and I was afraid, and I was like, and it just it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, who is this person who's talking about intimacy and with another man and stuff like this, right? And it really taught me like how deeply rooted these problems are of this lack of emotional sobriety, right? That even when I feel so good about these relationships and this brewing sort of intimacy, right? That from another perspective inside of my own psyche, it's like, whoa, don't go there. That's dangerous. And so, you know, so by its very nature, the concept or the idea or the conversation around this thing called feeling will probably feel threatening. It gets to the heart of this thing that's missing in us, right? And Wilson bravely identifies this problem in 1958. And Wilson, he critiques us in this lack of emotional sobriety or this lack of feeling. He critiques us because he knew that we wouldn't critique ourselves because of this dogma and this worship of him, etc. Right? And I loathe to say this, but his critique of the old timers, the people who stay in AA, who don't leave, I think his critique still holds. I think it still holds water. As in meetings, just in general, not even in meetings, but just in general, when people express feeling, right? When people express pain, when people express emotion, so often the old timers will jump in with this sort of masculine urge to fix everything and try to tell them that that they don't need to live that way anymore. And it's very dangerous. I want to say this. Alcoholics Anonymous is a highly evolved spiritual method. As I said before, we've been rocketed to the fourth dimension, of which we had barely even dreamed, right? We've we've achieved a certain level of spiritual enlightenment, right? Wilson says in the essay, we've perfected our booze cure. Well, we know it's a spiritual solution, right? And we've perfected this spiritual solution. We've reached rarefied spiritual heights, right? But the point is that the emotional sobriety lies somewhere else, right? It lies beyond this spiritual paradigm in the next frontier. And so this leads to my hook, which is this. Despite AA's spiritual heroics, our near mastery of spiritual principles and practices, we are yet to cultivate emotional sobriety. I know that this is really difficult to understand. It's strange. But I would invite you guys to just roll with me here on this. What we're gonna be doing is we're gonna sort of isolate spirituality from the next frontier, showing that these are actually two different complementary paths. Fundamentalists, right? The people that Wilson called out, I guess, they're going to argue progress, not perfection. We haven't perfected our spiritual programs, and I would suggest that yes, you're right. We haven't perfected our spiritual program, but we've reached a plateau. We've reached rarefied spiritual heights. This is a picture of a base camp on Mount Everest. It's as if we've moved into this base camp, right? So we still go to the summit every so often, and then we come back down to our base camp, and we sort of live in this elevated spiritual state. The problem is that emotional sobriety, it's an unfinished business, right? It still eludes us, right? Emotional sobriety has to be built on top of this spiritual foundation that we've laid, this foundation that takes decades to build, by the way. But that in order to achieve emotional sobriety, we've got to go beyond this spiritual attitude that we have. I often say that I'm going to make the case that we can absolutely address emotional sobriety by working the 12 steps, and that the keys are actually embedded in the 12 steps. But also the problem is embedded in the 12 steps as well. So a great metaphor of this is simply found in the fourth step. And this is my own experience, right? When I got to the fourth step, my sponsor told me to write down everyone who harmed me and then write down what they did very briefly. And then we're going to quickly move on to that fourth column. And that's where we're going to get relief. And so what did I do? Wrote down briefly how things had hurt me and then rocketed right over the second and third columns, right into the fourth column, went and made amends, and then told myself that everything was fine, right? But I still had so many little issues in the background. I was still being unfaithful with my wife, both financially as well as in sexual relations, being unfaithful, right? And sort of being able to hide behind this sort of spiritual kind of facade that I was putting on, but it's okay. Like I don't even think that made me less spiritual, right? If I look at spirituality from this new paradigm, which if you guys know me, you know, this is a new paradigm for me as well as anyone who listens, right? But that sort of promiscuity and desire and connection and hooking up, right? Hooking up. It's all about this rocketing to the fourth dimension. It's the puer archetype. The point is, though, that we've rocketed to the fourth dimension. We rocketed right over to the fourth column. So now it's time we come back and land the rocket ship and take a good hard look at the second and third column. I want to tell you guys a story. I was at a meeting a couple nights ago, and a couple of people who I've began to get close with, they're reworking their steps. And they're doing exactly that. They're really focusing on column 2 and 3. And they've been this meeting was amazing. They were there were a couple of girls and a couple of guys who I know very well. They just really opened up about where they were at in their step work, and that they were looking at these things in these second and third columns, and that it really hurt, that there's a lot of pain that's still in there that they just weren't really willing to look at before because nobody told them that they could. And this was perhaps one of the best meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous I'd ever been to. I was just like, I was moved, I was in the moment, and I was really excited to share. And what happened then was a perfect illustration of this whole sort of concept, right? Is that a couple of old timers, men, sort of bombarded in. One guy double dipped. So he took double the time that he should have been allotted. He has more time than everyone else, so I guess he felt justified. And then he tried to one up everybody's abuse. And then he proceeded to tell us that if we just did the steps the way they're written in the book, then we wouldn't feel that anymore, right? And then right when he finished, another old timer jumped in and did the same thing, and essentially, again, one-upped everybody else's abuse, and then said, "But I did the steps," and then poof, the pain was gone. And this is not to dismiss anybody's pain or anybody's process, right? But that if we talk about emotional sobriety, and if we get really honest about what we see in Alcoholics Anonymous, then it makes sense that people are leaving to go find emotional sobriety elsewhere. When they're being told in our rooms, we don't care how you feel and we don't care what you think, right? Feelings aren't facts, right? But in this new paradigm that I'm presenting here, it's not that feelings, they may not be facts. They're not subjective hard data, right? But what feelings are is really important information. That feelings represent a value system that I develop, this ideal, right? And that once I learned to tap into feeling, including pain, then not only do I find a much deeper level of healing, but in my life especially, I recognize that until I could really get in touch with my own pain, I could not have compassion for yours. And that pain really does become not the touchstone of spiritual growth. Pain becomes the touchstone of human relationship, right? And that's what allows people to have these intimate connections. Moving on. Wilson leaves us then with this rather important question, right? And this isn't Wilson's question. This is a question I formulated reading Wilson's essay. If living by spiritual principles doesn't produce emotional sobriety, then what does? And this question, again, it requires, if we go back to the metaphor of getting sober emotionally, then I think it makes sense, right? All of those things we thought were required for us to get sober physically, including what even was the problem. After a couple years of sobriety, 5 years, you recognize just how delusional you actually were in the early days, right? And this trek into the next frontier, I think, kind of presents us with that same sort of newcomer energy again, as we have to really like step aside and like and really kind of contemplate this whole thing from a brand new perspective. Spiritual practice is necessary to cultivate emotional sobriety, but it's not sufficient to produce emotional sobriety in and of itself. Like I said earlier, the decades of spiritual devotion that we put in here becomes the foundation upon which we build emotional sobriety. And the nature of spirituality is that it will plateau. The metaphor of the rocket is just absolutely incredible. The fact that Wilson packed that in there blows me away. All of his metaphors speak to this deeper level, actually. But the metaphor eventually runs out of fuel, right? The metaphor is rocketing through space and it runs out of fuel and it's going the wrong direction. And I know that when I began to look at this from this perspective, I could see this in my own life, and it was shocking. And now I just kind of see it throughout the entire fellowship. This leads to my thesis, right? So it's an answer to the question, but we cultivate emotional sobriety by cultivating our relationship with soul. We cultivate emotional sobriety by cultivating a relationship with soul or with psyche, right? Soul equals psyche, at least for now. And so what we're immediately faced with here is this really key distinction: spirit versus soul. Spirit would be defined as this vertical ascent, right? The spiritual transcendence, the fourth dimension, the spiritual hilltop, the pink cloud. Soul, on the other hand, is this horizontal depth, right? It's on the horizon. And what I encounter here on this horizon is I encounter human relationships and human people and interactions and involvements and gossip and messiness. That's the soul stuff. That's the emotional sobriety stuff. And both of these are necessary, but they both come together for each other's culmination. Now, this debate between spirit and soul actually has its roots in the 8th and 9th century in the church councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. And I'll spend a whole session on this in a few months. But that basically what happened is they were debating the role of soul and the role of spirit and the role of images, and spirit won out. And soul got marginalized, right? And actually became sort of embedded in this idea of spirit. And then what we're left with now, so many centuries later, is the legacy that James Hillman mentioned, and I'll read it again. Now we are at a loss, not knowing how to feel, where to feel, why to feel, or even if we feel. And so we begin to see a connection between feeling and soul, right? Meanwhile, spirit is unaware, flying through the air, of the distress and the mess that is left behind. And that is by definition spiritual, and it's perfectly fine just the way it is. It's just not enough in and of itself. Our spiritual programs need soul work in order to bring this kind of transcendent attitude that we have back down to the earth so that we can restore our capacity to feel. So again, we're landing the rocket. I love this quote from Wilson on page 19 of the Big Book, which he wrote in 1938. He says, "A much more important demonstration of our principles lies before us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs." That, I think, is a premonition of the concept of emotional sobriety, because it brings everything back home, right? I'm gonna read this from James Hillman. Again, he's the one who helped me to really put all this together about emotional sobriety. This is what he says. "At this point in our discussion, spirit and soul part company, and the paths of spiritual discipline and psychological development diverge. This divergence is usually not understood, since the complexities of the psyche too easily volatilize into the rarifications of spiritual formula. In spirit, persons and involvements are at best secondary. The psyche, soul, with its emotions, images, and attachments, is fundamentally a disturbance for spirituality, which proceeds, as Plotinus said, from alone to alone. In spiritual disciplines, even the community and the master are ultimately transpersonal abstractions. People are never as real as spirit. The veil of the world is transcended through retreat, meditation, and prayer. The spirit calls one up and out. It says, we shall overcome. We shall transcend even the we." And so this is some fascinating commentary within the context of emotional sobriety, right? If indeed to cultivate emotional sobriety requires cultivation of soul. Here's a quick list of kind of the differences between spirit and soul. On the left, we have spirit, vertical, soul, horizontal. Spirit is up and out. Soul, down and in. Spirit, right facing. Soul, left facing, symbolically speaking. Spirit, linear. Soul, cyclical. Spirit, masculine. Think of the Trinity. Soul, feminine. Think of Mother Earth. Spirit is phallic, the rocket ship, perfect example. Soul is yonic, like a container, the hermetic vessel. Spirit, objective, thinking. Soul, subjective, feeling. Spirit, egoic. Soul, psychical, right? Ego versus psyche. Spirit, fourth dimension stuff, that's our metaphor. Soul would be the third dimension, landing the rocket. Spirit, airy. Soul, earthy. Spirit, vapid. Soul, vaporous. Spirit, intoxicated. The Latin word for alcohol is spirits. Think of this. And then think of all the language that's embedded with our use of talking about intoxication, getting fucked up, getting high, getting blown away, right? They're all the same spiritual release. On the other hand, we have soul, which is grounded. Spirit, flighty. Soul, measured. Spirit, dry. Soul, submerged. Spirit, plain. Smooth. Soul, lumpy. And we could go on and on with this, right? But the realm of the soul then is embedded in this human relationship, right? It's in the here and now, in the horizontal, and in our relationships with one another. The spiritual plane, on the other, is transcendent. By its very nature, it's supposed to be transcendent. And once we understand this, then we can see how good AA is at providing a spiritual solution. It does everything that it's supposed to do. It falls perfectly in line with everything that Wilson or whoever designed it to do, that transcendent nature. But unfortunately, it doesn't do much because of the historical context in which Alcoholics Anonymous was formed. It doesn't do much to address the problem of soul. So getting back into this discussion of emotional sobriety, we'll try to quickly wrap this up and see how this all fits. Wilson defines emotional sobriety as the development of much more real maturity and balance in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God. That's I think Wilson's definition of emotional sobriety. And from a spiritual perspective, that is an absolutely perfect definition. It's a focus on stability, balance, maturity, a mature form of love. The other thing is too, from a spiritual perspective, we want emotional sobriety to be good feeling, right? Feeling good equals feeling God. Intoxication, spirit, right? But emotional sobriety also, it has to include the negative feeling. I think that within the context of emotional sobriety, there's room for hatred, vitriol. There's room for revenge. There's room for despair, depression. By the way, too, these are all feelings or affects or emotions or whatever that have an archetypal basis. Even in the Old Testament, Yahweh we're told he's a jealous, angry, and spiteful deity, right? So in our own quest for emotional sobriety, we would assume that we need to make a place for those as well. Now, whether they become affects and we act them out, that's a different story, right? But the point is that emotional sobriety creates the space wherein we can allow these things to exist. Wilson proposed his proposed solution to developing emotional sobriety is that we practice the St. Francis prayer. And you'll recall that the St. Francis prayer tells us that we should love rather than be loved, understand rather than be understood, and you know this, you know the prayer probably better than me. This is what Wilson says. This seems to be the primary healing circuit, an outgoing love of God's creation and his people by means of which we avail ourselves of his love for us. It is the most clear that the current can't flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken, and broken at depth. Only then can we possibly have a glimmer of what adult love really is. Now, I think that from a spiritual perspective, this is fine, but it's also clearly contained within a spiritual perspective, right? It suffers from soul blindness, right? Spirit does not recognize its own lack of feeling. It can't because it's rocketing through the air. It doesn't see the damage that's being left behind. St. Francis, in his stuff, is already showing symptoms of this loss of soul. He comes along 400 years after the Nicene and Constantinople councils, right? So he himself lacks an adequate value system, which we would call feeling, that can allow him to distinguish between genuine human needs and spiritual aspirations. And this becomes a key kind of delineation as we try to separate soul from spirit. So the kind of love St. Francis suggests is the kind of love that we've already been trying to practice in step 3. And it's this idea of self-abandonment, right? This is what it says. We thought this is out of the big book. We thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to him. And so while love is an essential ingredient in emotional sobriety, it doesn't represent the entire recipe. As I said before, emotional sobriety has to make a space for the negative emotions as well. And if we don't make space for those negative emotions, then they come out sideways, right? And we're going to talk about what that looks like when they come out sideways in using my own experiences, my own example, as well as Bill Wilson's, right? Because there's a clear correlation between the lack of emotional sobriety and then the way we behave in our relationships. Our modern spiritual culture, whether it's in AA, in church, Eastern religion, the idea is that we transcend these human needs. But emotional sobriety requires that we feel and that we meet our human needs, both in ourselves and in other people. So the prayer of St. Francis exemplifies a selfless spiritual ideal. But the limitation is that self-abandonment can't go the whole way there, right? It plateaus, and it becomes a spiritual bypass, right? And it's so easy for the ego to hide behind its spiritual discipline and justify the lack of feeling. So again, spiritual bypass is seeking spiritual highs while avoiding underlying emotional pain. What spirituality can't solve, soul work must address through feeling, right? So if feeling is a value system that allows us to make decisions that to judge whether things are good or bad for us, spirit lacks the discernment, right? So spirit has a hard time even determining what is an unhealthy attachment, or what is a healthy attachment, or what is a genuine human need. If the whole goal is self-abandonment, then you shouldn't have any needs. And we see this all the time in AA. I have a good friend who's always talking about how his expectations get him into trouble. And as I listen more closely, I think, bro, those aren't expectations. Those are human needs. You're going to the wrong source to get your human needs met. We all want our sponsors and our parents and our siblings to meet these really underlying archetypal human needs, right? But the problem is it's very sad, and we grieve those relationships, but often those people cannot meet us on this level of soul. Hillman writes this: dependence and need are basic and will appear most strongly whenever we attempt to most strongly in our experience whenever we attempt to limit the soul through fixing borders of separated existence. In other words, the more we practice self-abandonment, the more strongly our human needs are going to manifest, and these needs of the soul. And again, they often come out sideways. Emotional sobriety is really important because intimacy requires two people, right? I can't just practice emotional sobriety in relationship with somebody who cannot meet me on the same level, right? And so, unfortunately, emotional sobriety then leads to sort of a change in relationships, right? Often the older it's so much like getting sober physically. When we get sober, we have to leave many of our former relationships because they're no longer safe for us. In emotional sobriety, we do the same thing. It's not that we leave, it's just that we go somewhere where a lot of our former relations can't come. And so they fail to meet us. And so we want to just be careful. There's a spiritual blunder we make in terms of emotional sobriety, which is that we confuse our human needs with what Bill Wilson calls faulty dependencies, right? And it takes emotional sobriety to even be able to tell the difference, because that's the value system that we cultivate that is called feeling. This is the last slide. So spirit can't foster feeling because it tries to abandon feeling as an affect that it needs to get rid of in order to fulfill its spiritual calling. Feeling is the antidote to spiritual bypass. Emotional sobriety is the antidote to the spiritual bypass. Jung's feeling function is, as complex as this idea sounds, is equated to emotional sobriety. And I think it's worth exploring emotional sobriety through this lens to really try to grasp and grapple with what it means. If all we're working is a spiritual program, then we're going to lack a subjective value system that allows us to determine what's good for us and what's not, what's a healthy relationship and what's not. This statement that we hear too often in AA, your feelings aren't facts, that really denies our ability to connect as humans. Feelings aren't facts, but they offer very important information, and that we want to learn to understand and look at our feelings as we move along. This is a quote from James Hillman. He says, "The utilitarian connection the spirit makes betrays a structural inability to handle what is today called human feeling." And so we talk about this structural limitation, right? It's this totally vertical kind of thing. You know, it's for the spirit to be in relationship as it's rocketing into the fourth dimension. It's that any relationship that it has is going to be kind of touch and go out there in space, moving at high speeds the way spirit likes to do. So it's structurally unable to handle the horizontal world of human relationship, right? And then Jung says this: the soul can only live in and from human relationships. So he says somewhere else that we cannot achieve wholeness by ourselves. We can't achieve wholeness without relationships to other people. And what we find in this world of soul is we encounter the relationships that we have with people. That's like the thing that hits us first is our relationships. And it's very interesting because the steps have this all built in. So we can cultivate this kind of soul work. We can do soul making within the context of the steps, the way I'm presenting soul making. It's in the 12 steps, but we just have to have a different perspective in order to approach it that way. So that's kind of the case I'm going to be making. It's a case for coming down, right? That we recover the soul, that we can recover soul in the program of recovery. We just have to learn how to do so. And this, my friends, is the journey into the next frontier that Wilson invites us to take. So with that, right at the top of the hour, I will stop and I will turn it over to David or whoever. And yeah.
You don't want him to stop, so you don't. You can unmute everyone. You'd like him to keep going, wouldn't you, really? That's great, Cody. Thank you for that. That was wonderful. You can unmute everyone, yeah. If you'd like to unmute, you can unmute, I believe. Rob, can people unmute themselves? You can now, you can. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Cody.
Cody. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
Cody,
you so
that was
much, Cody.
brilliant.
That's so
Thank you.
interesting.
Cody.
That
was fabulous.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you.
Cody. Thank you.
Thank you,
Wow.
Cody.
Superb, Cody. Thank you.
I
Thank you,
understood a lot
Cody.
of it.
Oh, food for the soul, I would say. But let's just, Cody, will you have a little break for a second? We'll come back to you. We're going to have a Q&A with Cody. We just want to mention some meetings that are coming up just quickly, what we have next week. And we're going to develop, Cody's kicked us off for a month. We're going to have 4 weeks or 5 weeks of emotional sobriety. So that was Cody Peterson, emotional displacement and rearrangements. Of course, that's taken from the big book, but Cody was basing it. If you read it from his book, it says, the road to recovery doesn't begin when one decides to quit drinking at all, he said, but rather with one's decision to reconceive the symbol of God for oneself. Cody said, once that fundamental psychic change occurs, it opens the door to a cascade of emotional displacements and rearrangements that young promised Roland would follow. Wow, that's fantastic. And this is the cover of the book if you haven't seen it yet. And there's a website for it as well, A Shadow of a Figure of Light, the Archetype of the Alcoholic, and the Journey to Enlightenment with Cody Peterson. Now we're back here on Sunday. We're back with we're reading Bill Shaberg's book. Cody made reference to it there. We're writing the big book, The Creation of AA. We're reading that. We're on chapter 15. We had the author with us a couple of weeks back. We're on chapter 15. We're continuing that, the 100 Men Corporation. Next week, we got Jim Worley coming along to build on what we've already heard tonight. But Jim Worley, as you all know, is from AA History Only. Emotional Sobriety, Bill Wilson's Fourth Legacy. That's going to be part 1 of 2 for Jim, because the following week we have Mark Vernon coming along. He's going to be talking to us about William Blake. He's just got a new book out on William Blake and the power of the imagination. And then we have Jim coming back, and Joe Chisholm is coming along then following that. But just quickly on the last bit from me, Cody is back with us on the 1st of August, and he said, as he said tonight, he's going to do the second part. It's going to be on feelings. So we're calling that part 2, and then he's coming back to us. Cody, I haven't confirmed this with you yet, but it's the 29th of August. You're back with us then. So there's a big gap between the two of them in August, the beginning and the end, Cody. I can talk to you about that. But Jim Worley is going to be back doing sponsorship. And we've got Randy. Thank you for arranging this for us, Randy. You got this for us. We have the influence of AA and the subsequent inception of Cocaine Anonymous and its development as a 12-step fellowship with Cameron Freeman. So we have an insight into the development of Cocaine Anonymous. So thank you for that, Randy. So, Rob, did you want to mention that? And quickly, did you want to bring to people's attention to something you want to do?
Yes, tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 5 p.m. Pacific Time, Gary Neidhart and Kathy are going to be starting the book Bobby B, The Untold Story of AA's Fantastic Communicator. It's my understanding that Gary will be there tonight, and they are going to be reading the book word for word, chapter by chapter. So, and that is starting tonight. So if you know about Bobby B, or if you've never heard about Bobby B, and fascinating lady, and really touches the heartstrings. I'll be honest with you. So that information will all be in the chat. So
thank you, Rob. Wonderful stuff. Now we're back to Cody. It blows my mind. Wonderful, in the most wonderful way. In the most wonderful way. Cody, I just struck me. I'm going to kick it off. Maybe I just throw this in when you were sharing. I mean, lots of stuff, but I've argued with people over many years, and you covered this quite well tonight. But AA being a bridge to normal living is a term, and I've argued with him saying that a 12-step spiritual program can be nothing other than a bridge to spiritual living. And I caught a lot of that from your presentation. And thank you for sharing that. Some people will just say, just don't talk about feelings, don't talk about 4 dimensions, don't talk about anything else. And I said to him, well, that's your group, and you're entitled to do that. But we try to do step 10 and 11 and grow an understanding, get a better understanding. But of course, primarily it's all about the newcomer. Cody, thanks for that. If you want to come back on anything I said there, please do. But if not, we raise the hands up. Randy, did you want to? There you go. Chip is coming in. Chip J, Rule 62, man.
Thank you, Chip Alcoholic. And I got so much of what you were talking about, Cody. The idea that I can work the steps well enough to rise above my own humanity was stuck in my head for so long. I started going to ACA and because my wife was now ex-wife was already going, and she brought this home to me. If you don't mind, it'll just take like a minute to read it. This is written by a priest. So-called deadly or capital sins are not sins at all, but 7 disorderly propensities in our personalities that lead to sinful behavior. Pride, self-respect; covetousness, self-preservation; lust, communion; anger, personal freedom; gluttony, self-expression; envy, lack of celebration; sloth, lack of relaxation, are sound and healthy human proclivities gone askew. The
Right.
cardinal sins result not from fundamental evil, but from fundamental goodness running out of control.
Chip,
Human
Chip, can I
love.
just cut across? Because we don't have it to see visually, it would be difficult. Can you just make the point on what you're trying to make and connect it back to Cody's presentation? And we'll have a meeting after the
Oh,
meeting.
yeah, okay, yeah. I agree with everything you were saying. I mean, yeah, we damage ourselves by creating an ideology even, that spirituality means not feeling. I don't even like that word spiritual anymore because it's so heavy, it's so heavy with bullshit.
That's good.
Okay,
Let's
I'll
put that
just say
back to
it. Thank
Cody.
you.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's great, Chip. Thanks for kicking us off there. Cody, back to you. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Rich. I appreciate that. And I see so many people who venture into ACA and who venture into Al-Anon. I've kind of made the made the case lately, and I might try to do some more around this, but it's that I feel like perhaps the soul of Alcoholics Anonymous has sort of scooted her way into Al-Anon. Al-Anon is the realm of it represents human relationships, right?
Mhm.
As far as the reading, I don't know where you pulled that from, but I'm going to do my best to respond from this new paradigm, right? So I'm speaking a new language, and I'm fully aware of that, and it's going to be a hard one to get to come around to. It can feel shocking almost. So in terms of spiritual discipline, I think that the seven deadly sins and everything else they are what they are. They serve their role. And I don't know if you got that from ACA or what, but in terms of soul making, and if we go back to feeling, right, and emotional sobriety, that each of those seven deadly sins, they become a very personal matter, right? Because what I'm trying to do in developing emotional sobriety is to create my own ideal or my own value system that allows me to relate to the rest of the world, whether that be with things, with relationships, or with ideals like notions, whether they be religious notions, things I hear in Alcoholics Anonymous, things I hear from my sponsor, my wife, my parents, etc. And so when we talk about developing this feeling function or developing emotional sobriety, then I think what we want to try to look at everything else in terms of, first of all, how does it feel, right? How does that feel for me to hear that? And do I relate to it? Do I feel like it's a good practice for me? That's kind of my response to that. I don't know if you had a question, but I like this Q&A because it does give us a chance to sort of stretch this stuff out a little bit and try to get a handle on this sort of new thing. Yo.
That's great. Good. Chip, if you could put the details in the chat, we'd appreciate it. Or send it to Rob. Rob will put it in the chat for you. Chip, if you could do that, thank you. We do have a meeting after the meeting, so that'll be probably in 25 minutes. We can go into more detail into stuff like that. Thank you for keeping it like that. Randy's with us in Ontario, Canada.
Hi, thank you, Randy Alcoholic. Thanks for the presentation, Cody. I'm curious, on one of your slides that you had soul as the third dimension, spirit as the fourth dimension. What would be the simplistic terms, say, for the first and second dimension then?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. The what I'll say is this, from a more robust academic tradition, the fourth dimension would be a feminine dimension, while the third dimension would represent a masculine dimension. The Trinity is a perfect example of a spiritual system that's very masculine, right? I mean, it's literally three deities who form one Godhead, and they're all male. So I'm using fourth dimension only in the way that we use it as a metaphor in Alcoholics Anonymous, because I think it's easy for us to grasp onto. But if I were to be more like technically accurate, you know, it's certain, you know, it would have to be a different metaphor. So, and as far as the first and second, I mean, I don't know. I've heard people talk about the fourth dimension being just, everyone has their own ideas about that, and love to hear your guys' ideas. But that's kind of my response to your question. So,
Thank you.
for asking.
Thank you, Randy. See you Sunday as well. Rich, hello, Rich.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes, coming in clear.
Oh, perfect, perfect. I didn't know if my name came up there. So my name is Rich. I'm alcoholic, and hey, Cody, it's good to see you. Great talk, and hello to everybody else. I'm out in Huntington Beach. Hey, so I just heard you got done talking about the feminine, the masculine, and you know, I've been sober for a minute, and I had the pleasure of getting to hang out with Cody for a while, and really kind of take me down the path of Carl Jung in a way that I have never really gone, to be honest. And I was trying to really, like, you know, this emotional sobriety after years of working the steps, working with other guys. I felt like I thought I figured it out every time I would come close to trying to feel like I had some emotional, like I was regulating my emotions somehow through the steps. But it wasn't really until like I started like looking into, like, after the archetype of the alcohol, you know, I started looking at the shadow self. So what are your thoughts on the idea of Jung's individuation and aligning the feminine, the masculine through the anima and the animus, and how that can play such an integral role in really getting to a place where, like, for me, like right now, I will just say this, that you know, it's really kind of, I'm on that journey right now, just so you know, Cody, of really kind of studying a little bit more about that, thanks to you and your book. And what are your thoughts on the anima and animus, and how we can utilize Jung's theory, or on individuation, and aligning those together? You know, what do you think about that? And what's your thoughts?
Yeah. Thanks, Rich. Great question. And so anima is actually the Latin word for soul, right? So we have soul, we have psyche, which is the Greek word, and then we have anima, which is the Latin word. Jung actually differentiated between those three quite carefully, and he was pretty careful not to use the word soul, because it comes with so much religious baggage, right? People have their preconceived notions about what the soul is, and so he preferred the other words, anima and psyche. So I'm gonna talk a lot about these in a few months, just kind of here and there as we go. But this really is the nature of soul making, right? That the goal. So the goal is to examine the soul, and what that means. It's such a loaded like conversation. It's hard to even answer the question. But I'm going to try to answer the question in the coming months of what does it mean to engage with the soul? What does it mean to give soul a place in our own lives? How do we practice? Like, you know, we practice spirituality. It's a way of practice. It's a way of living. It's a certain attitude that we have. And soul is sort of it's kind of the opposite of everything we do in the spiritual realm, because it's so intertwined with human relationships. Our relationship with soul determines our relationship with other human beings, right? And this is why I think that the framework for us in the 12 steps of emotional sobriety is so useful, right? Because without emotional sobriety, our relationships are going to continue to look a little off, right? Because the anima might be in charge rather than us, for example. So, and you know, I've had a lot of kind of my own experience in this, having, you know, over the last, you know, 4 or 5 years, really just coming up against my own lack of emotional sobriety, and you know, looking specifically at my relationship with my wife, especially now, like looking back, I can just see how fraught the relationship was, and how I was hiding behind this idea of spiritual transcendence. And I was really unable to hear her pleas for deeper connection, for intimacy, for just for me to show up, you know. And as you know, we talk about the masculine and feminine, we look at our culture, we look at the tropes that men have and women and stuff, and we really have our work cut out for us, I think, in this regard, especially as men, because we're so hesitant to talk about intimacy, to be intimate with each other. We don't even know what that means. Even just saying like, "Hey, I want to be intimate with you," we automatically go to like, "Oh, that's gay" or whatever, right? So there's so many, like, just so many roadblocks in the way that are really cultural, right? And and this is just it's just an interesting journey to go through this and to talk about it in terms of soul making, you know. I've really had this thought, and then I'll go to the next, but that you know, I talk a lot about this weird kind of Jungian theory that I love that you guys are down for and you come along for and everything. But in terms of its practical application, emotional sobriety is where the rubber meets the road. And so if I were to make a case for the reason the theory is important, I would point to my own life and my own relationships as evidence that this stuff actually works. And so, you know, this soul making activity and putting this stuff within this context really has some profound kind of reverberating effect in our day-to-day, you know, as Wilson says, in our various homes, occupations, and affairs, right? So this is where the rubber meets the road. This concept of feeling becomes the you know, it is the medium, right, in real life of how this stuff all plays out. So thanks, Rich. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Rich. And Rob's put Cody's details in the chat. Rob, do you want to read out what Cody's details for anyone might happen to listen to us on this later on? Alki,
It'd be my pleasure, David. Thank you very much. Let me just pull them up again. So Cody Peterson, email archetype@gmail.com, and I'll spell that out for people. ALKYARCHETYPE@gmail.com. And then we have his WhatsApp groups. There's a couple of those. And then the website is https://www.cody-peterson.com. And then we got also Cody-Peterson.com/video. So those are different places that you can get Cody's information.
Thank you, Rob, for that. And is that phone number okay to read out, Cody? Should we read it out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Phone number is 725-502-3114.
Thank you, Rob. Now we have the audio of this, and we put on running on the standing website. But Cody, hopefully, we're going to have the visual for you, and we pass that over to Cody, and Cody will edit what he needs to do with it, and then he puts it up on. Cody, you puts that on your YouTube channel, do you, or something?
Yeah.
So if you want to watch and listen again, well, I'll definitely be listening again. But Phoenix Friends of Carl Young is with us. So what's your name? Tell us your name and come in.
I'm Charlie Alcoholic.
Hello, Charlie.
I just use this Zoom account because I don't know, I'm just used to it more. But I wanted to delve into your discussion of the fourth step a little bit, because hitherto I've always been of the mind that the first three columns are just getting you to the fourth column because the fourth column deals with me. It's the only thing I can really have any direct effect on. But you've got me thinking, and I want to be sure I'm catching your drift, is that there's actually a lot of stuff going on in columns 2 and 3 that are well worth looking into. Because, for example, in certain cases, there's Joe Blow. What did he do? What an effect it had on me, and it might have had a pretty traumatic effect, so to speak. And what was my part in it? Well, I helped, but it sort of almost seems to me that what you're saying is if you forget about the second and third column, then you're not getting the full benefit of that particular step because you're sort of just I don't know, hiding or not dealing with that which actually did happen. And it's almost sort of like the Jungian shadow concept where, certain unsavory things are pushed down below the surface, but yet they still have an effect whether one's willing to deal with them or not. Am I sort of on the right track there?
Yeah, I
Did
mean,
I
you're like,
understand what you were talking about?
you're right on it. You're right on it. And it's good to see you, Charlie. And also I want to thank you for bringing this up and for kind of reiterating this because that's exactly what I'm saying. Um, you know, I had this thought a few weeks ago, I guess, that if we look at, you know, Wilson's own psychology has filtered into the program. That's safe to say, right? And he was a war veteran, lived during the Great Depression, lost, millions of dollars, um, you know, and I think of my grandpa a lot actually, in this comparison, just this kind of rugged, like really stiff old man who went, was in World War II, um, you know, uh, and I wonder if their psychologies weren't similar, and as we sort of evolve this program, the 12 steps and Alcoholics Anonymous, the thought comes to me like that I think from the pinnacle that we get to stand on today, we can go deeper in these steps than perhaps our predecessors were able to. It's like this isn't your grandpa's inventory. Like my grandpa, if he did an inventory, let me tell you, it probably wouldn't go very deep. And so then the question comes to, this the second and third column is that after time in the program, right? So maybe the first inventory we do, we're just trying to stay sober. Yeah, let's get you right through those two columns because they don't have anything to do with you, and let's get you some relief, right? But then I wonder if we do ourselves a disfavor if later on we continue to hide behind that spiritual enlightenment and to deny ourselves access to our own pain. Because the pain is actually this thing that I think becomes very healing for us, right? And it's very easy for us within a spiritual program to sort of deny it and just skip over it. But the thing is, it does end up coming out one way or another. And so the invitation is, yeah, it's to when you do the second and third columns, and this has to do with these more sort of grave betrayals, right? The inventory Wilson puts in the big book is it's almost silly, right? Like it's his parents aren't on there, like obviously that probably not his inventory or whatever, but the inventories that are the most meaningful are going to deal with those really primary relationships. And the bottom line is that I don't think that we have the luxury of just not feeling the effects of our childhood as we get sober and as we get older. For me, the way this plays out is I saw the evidence of this in my own relationships, right? It's that, and because of the way I was treated as a child, and I've let my parents off the hook. I understand they were doing the best that they could do. That's totally a given. That there's no question about that. They probably did better than I could do in the same position, obviously, right? I'm a gutter drunk. I'm a complete train wreck of an alcoholic. But that I still tend to carry these patterns into my own relationship. And like, if I don't really look at my childhood and really examine those relationships and really look at kind of what makes me tick, then it becomes very difficult for me to break through these adaptations in my adult relationships. And so I think that really that work starts with the work we're talking about here really does start in the second and third column. Now, going back to like the idea of soul work, we can make the case right off the bat that Wilson includes this in the 12 steps. Step 1, powerlessness, understood. Step 2 and 3, spiritual steps, launching to the fourth dimension, self-abandonment, right? All of the things that really define what a spiritual program looks like kind of find their way into step 2 and 3. But then when we have steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, Wilson invites us to come back down and to get back down on the earth, almost to set aside our spiritual practice for a little while and do this soul work. And I think if we approach those steps with this attitude, then we can have a different experience with them, right? But it starts with that second column. And really, how honest are we being in column 2 and column 3? I know that for me, and I'm a sick alcoholic, so this may or may not be your story. But when I came in this last time, in 2013, my parents weren't even on my inventory, right? I had forgiven them. Like that was it. You told me to forgive them, I forgave them. They're alcoholics, I get it. I'm an alcoholic. Totally understood. With about 10 or 11 years of sobriety, so just recently, I found myself doing another inventory, and they're the only names on the list, right? And it's a different perspective, right? I've been really and this goes against everything we're told in the program, so it can feel jarring and scary, right? But it's like I'm trying to get into that pain and to like, how did this really affect me, right? What lingering resentments do I have? How does my childhood pain still exist and still define my life today? And what I found is this: there becomes kind of a shift, right? In alchemy, I love alchemy because it gives us these wonderful metaphors of spiritual transformation. One of the operations in alchemy, if you will, was that they would use a big wide open pan and they would drop the prima materia into it, whatever that was, lead or something moist and mushy and gooey. That's that kind of resentment, right? And then they hit that with fire. That's the fire of the anger of my resentment, right? And as they would light that pan on fire and really get that stuff in there hot, all the smoke and all the vapor would evaporate, right? And eventually what's sitting on the bottom of the pan is just like a nice, crispy white substance that's kind of salty, right? In terms of our emotional pain and the process of the steps, right? That it's true, we can get rid of all of that mushy sort of like self-pity, all the garbage that comes with these resentments, but underneath those resentments is something essential, and that's that salt that's left in the bottom of the pan, and that salt is the same salt that courses through our veins, our all of our bodily fluids, and it's coursing through your bodily fluids, right? It's this universal sort of substance, right? And in getting in touch with those emotions and that pain and doing this work, it really was the thing that allowed me, like I said in my presentation, this opened up the world of compassion for me. Until I could accept my own pain, I simply did not have access to compassion for other people, and I wanted it. Now, and people would talk to me about developing compassion. I'd hear it in meetings, et cetera, and it just was something that was foreign to me. I felt like I didn't have access to that. But after I did this work this way, then I really began to, I noticed, like, in my relationship with my wife specifically, like I found myself really having compassion for her pain, for her sickness. Like if she caught a cold or something, I mean, I literally was like, and I can look back and it's all based on my childhood, right? Like if somebody was sick, I was like, well, you know, man up, like, let's go, we got work to do, you know. Or if somebody was in pain, if somebody had some sort of ailment, right, like especially somebody in a close relationship with me, I was unable to process that as they're actually having pain. And this is after working the steps and being sober. And so I don't know, I think that, you know, we have to attack these things kind of sideways. I think this is one of the ways we can do it. So anyways, thank you, Charlie. I appreciate your question, man. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Charlie. We're going to Jim M now. Hello, Jim.
Hello, Dave. Hi. Cody, really great to hear you talk again. I'm wondering if what I'm going to say is not really a question, but it's through personal experience, reinforcing some of the points that Cody made, in terms of emotional sobriety. So whether I should leave that till after, you know, after the meeting's finished.
Yeah.
Should I leave it till after the meeting's finished?
I
That's the
appreciate
question.
that. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah,
We
okay.
can go straight to you after that. That's great. So, Cody, if you wanted to just say anything, I think I'll just go to your book to close, and I'm going to I'm just looking for one. I think number 4, the introduction, personal roots. Cody, if you wouldn't mind reading just maybe the quote by Young and maybe just the first opening, I'll put up on the screen for you. We read through this as a group, and we were blown away by it all. And Cody came along a couple of times, so we appreciate that. Let me just get it up on the screen. I'm having it. I think it just covers what you've been saying, Cody. I know nothing could really cover completely, but if you wouldn't mind reading that, maybe the beginning of the next page, Cody.
Sure. It says, this is a quote from Carl Jung: "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Since earliest times, the path to enlightenment has been portrayed through symbolic stories of adventure, mythical tales that begin with a hero's plunge into the dark. Such tales are meant to be reflective of a pilgrimage into the parts of ourselves where we hope to discover the spiritual powers needed to bring healing and peace to our lives. And yet, while we usually think of the darkness as a barrier to our becoming enlightened, the energy that generates a truly life-changing spiritual transformation is only found in the darkness, making our engagement with it of primary concern."
And if I could just say that Cody then goes on to say the process laid out in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, meant to bring about a spiritual awakening in its practitioners, is a modern, this is Cody Peterson, is a modern template for enlightenment for all quote unquote normies and alcoholics alike. Wonderful stuff. And Cody's dedicated the book to, Ming is with us tonight, and Cody's mentioned her, and Cody, he calls her, you know, magical other. Ming, would you like to say hello to us even? That'd be nice. I hope you can unmute Ming. I know you were here. Maybe Ming, are you still with us?
Oh, she might be. Oh, there she is.
Yes, I was having difficulty
Hi, Ming.
finding the mute button. Hi, guys.
Thanks for keeping his feet to the fire for us.
Keeping his feet to the fire is what I do. Hello, everyone. I'm sending you love.
Thank you, Ming.
I don't have a comment today, but lots of love to you guys.
I love that Cody dedicated the book to, he said, to the only outstanding mind with whom conversation isn't, and he put in parentheses, usually in parentheses, complicated. I love that. That's Cody, will you, thank you, sir. Listen, I call you sir, but you know, you're a good virtual friend, a fellowship friend. It's wonderful to have you here and to be able to talk this way with you and listen to your thoughts. My life has been a lot better as a result of listening to your presentations. Trust me on that one. It's beautiful. So will you close the meeting for us in a manner of your choosing, and we welcome you back then in August.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. Let's go ahead and do the third step prayer. I like that prayer, and I'm going to do my best to remember it. I don't have it with me, but
If
feel
you
free
give
to.
me 1 moment, I will put up on the screen, Cody.
Oh,
If you just
perfect.
want to mention, Rob, will you just mention something that's coming up, and I'll just get this up on the screen for people while we do that. If that's
Not a problem. Yeah, later on tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern time, there will be a book reading of Bobby Berger, a great communicator. That's coming up tonight, 8 p.m. I'll put the information again in the chat. They're reading the book. It's a great book, and they're just starting it tonight, so it's a great time to get involved. Also, Eamon's 40-year plus people with sobriety. That is on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern time. That information will also be put up. And then we have on Sunday, writing of the big book right here at the Growing and Understanding group. And it's the 100-Man Corporation continuation. That is at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And that's about it I have right now.
Thank you. What great timing that was. So back to Cody Peterson. Cody, take it away.
Thank you. Let's see. All right. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Amen.
Thank you. Let's hear it one more time for Cody Peterson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Cody.
Cody.
Thank you so much, Cody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Cody.
Cody.
Cody, it was
Have a
terrific.
wonderful-
Thank you.
Thank you, Cody.
Amazing.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cody. Awesome workshop.
Thank you, everyone. We've stopped the recording.